Well, welcome to this, your first Bio 181 lecture. And before we get started talking a little bit about this introduction to biology in this first lecture, I want to remind everybody that based on your learning style, it may be better for you to first read the textbook and then use this as follow-up supplemental information, or vice versa. So if you're a multimodal learner, if you're an auditory learner, or a visual audio learner, you may want to watch these lectures first or listen to the podcasts of them and then read your textbook to supplement. If, on the other hand, you tend to be a reading, writing person, then you may want to read the textbook first and then supplement your learning with this audio visual. Whichever way works best for you, we're going to launch now into a discussion on what biology is, and over the three parts of this lecture we're going to do a few different things. We're going to talk briefly about what biology is. I'm going to introduce you to the concept of the cell and something called cell theory. We're going to briefly look at the tree of life and all of the different kinds of organisms that are found here on planet Earth. And last, we're going to wrap up by talking about how scientists conduct research. So let's start out on this first topic. What is biology? Well, if we look at the actual etiology or the origins of the word biology, bio means life, and ology means study of. So if we put those two together, biology, it literally means the study of life. And the study of life is a discipline that's been around, obviously, for centuries and centuries and centuries. And one of the first times it really had a change or an increase in information was right around the mid-1600s with the development of something called a microscope. And that led to the cell theory development in the 1800s, and I'm going to talk about that first. Later on, near the end of the semester, we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about another discovery that really changed biology as a discipline, which happened in the mid-1800s, which was the discovery of the law or theory, you can call it either, of evolution and the process of natural selection by which evolution occurs. Now, you'll notice in the first chapter of your book that it does talk about evolution and natural selection briefly. Please do read that, because we will revisit that topic at the end of the semester, and I'll make allusions to it throughout the semester until we get there. That being said, let's talk about the cell. The very first time we realized that there were these small units of life called cells happened only after we had the ability to see them for the first time. And that didn't occur until the mid-1600s, when a gentleman by the name of Robert Hooke developed the first, what we call, microscope. Now, it was pretty rudimentary. It could really only magnify organisms about 30 times. So by today's standards, it wasn't much. But it was enough for him to look at some bark off of an oak tree and see under the microscope all these what look like little tiny grid-like structures. And those eventually became known as cells. Now, another guy followed after Robert Hooke, a guy by the name of Anton van Leeuwenhoek, and he improved the microscope that Robert Hooke had developed, and he actually developed a microscope that could actually magnify things up to 300 times. And boy, did that allow him to see a lot more things. He started looking at human cells like blood cells. He started looking at paramecia, which are a little type of single-celled organism you find in pond water under the microscope. And then as we got better and better optics, as we developed better and better microscopes leading up into the 1800s, that led to us developing some pretty basic understandings about cells, how they function, and what they are. And that led to the development of something called the cell theory. So what exactly is the cell theory? Well, the cell theory is basically a collection of basic principles about cells, things that we know are true of all cells. It doesn't matter whether the cell came from a mushroom, if the cell came from a whale, if the cell came from a tree or from us. There are some basic qualities or elements that all cells on planet Earth share. And the first one is that the cell is the smallest unit of life. And what that simply means is you cannot get any smaller than a cell and have all the elements and emergent properties present that we define as being living. So in other words, if I took a cell and I tried to chop it up into littler pieces, those littler pieces would not function as a living organism. So that's the first one, the first part of the cell theory, that the cell is the smallest unit of living material. Second thing is we know that all cells share some common features to them, one of which is this thing called a plasma membrane. Some textbooks call it a cell membrane. It means the same thing. If you look at this picture here of this cell, I'm highlighting around the edge the plasma membrane, or what is called the cell membrane. And the plasma membrane we're going to learn about later in the semester is composed of lots of molecules of fat, a special kind of fat called a phospholipid. But the main purpose of this cell or plasma membrane is to define the boundary between the inside of the cell and the contents inside of the cell and its external environment. The other thing that we know is true of all cells is that they have within them lots of different types of functional molecules. Things like this nucleus in the middle of the cell is one example, but there are many others. And these functional molecules within the cell coordinate together to perform specific actions, activities for that cell. For example, you'll have a collection of molecules inside every cell whose job it is to manufacture energy for the cell. You have another collection of molecules inside every cell whose job it is to store information for the cell. And another collection that's involved in manufacturing items for export out of the cell, for example. Later in the semester, we're going to learn about all of these different kinds of functional molecules. Some of them are called inclusions, some are called organelles, but we'll touch on that later. And it doesn't, again, matter whether you're talking about a bacterial cell, a yeast cell, a human cell. They all share these common elements. Another key component of the cell theory is this idea that all cells occur from pre-existing cells. In other words, cells do not spontaneously just pop out of thin air. Okay, they are all derived from pre-existing cells. That means every cell in your body came from some other pre-existing cell. It means every cell in a dolphin, every cell in a sunflower, every cell in a microscopic paramecium that you find in pond water, all came from pre-existing cells. And if we go back and look at the history of planet Earth, we know that somewhere around 3.5 to 3.7 billion years ago, the first living cell appeared on planet Earth. Okay, and there's a whole process of chemical evolution that led to the development of the first living organism that we'll talk about in a few weeks' time. But for now, let's just take it as about 3.5 billion years ago, we had the first appearance of a cell on planet Earth. And from that single cell, every single cell and every single living organism that we know of today on planet Earth is derived from that one-celled ancestor. So all cells come from pre-existing cells. Now this was a big deal back in the Middle Ages and going into the time of when the cell theory was developed, because prior to that time people had a very different outlook on how things like cells or organisms came to be. They believed in something called spontaneous generation. And in spontaneous generation, they believed that an inanimate object could give rise to a living organism. I'll give you an example. A farmer would leave a bag of grass seed in the corner of his barn over winter, and in the middle of winter he'd go check on the grass seed and suddenly see an entire colony of mice in the grass seed. They believed that grass seed, in their way of thinking, an inanimate object could give rise to mice. Now we all know that's not true. We know that grass seed serves as a food source for mice. The mice are attracted to the grass seed and they set up shop near their food. But at the time it was thought that somehow there was some magical process by which grass seed converted into a mouse. So this idea of the cell theory that all came about after the advent of the microscope really shifted our understanding of the natural world and shifted biological science into a whole new realm of investigation. Now, on the next part of this investigation, or I'm sorry, of this lecture, we'll pick up where we left off here, and we'll continue on our discussion of cells, and we'll talk a little bit about the biology of all the different types of organisms on planet Earth, looking at the tree of life, etc. And I will see you there.